Hi, today we're going to talk about the first phase in the interaction design project, which is the discovery phase. Topics that we are going to discuss: what constitutes the discovery phase framework, how do we collect information and functional requirements, how do we interpret what we have collected, how do we document, and what constitutes a design scenario. Discovery. What does discovery means? Discovery means that you will be able to identify who are the people who will use the project, the things, what they use to do their work, what processes are involved, what type of information, what type of constraints and inputs and outputs. Then we will interpret this information by concentrating and creating descriptions of people, and describing the goals of the project, documenting step by step the work step by step, creating stories and scenarios about the work that is to be done, maybe creating charts and diagrams of workflow, and tracing different stories or scenarios identified from various people or stakeholders. During the discovery, we concentrate to know what people need from the design and the proper tools to gather this information. If we look at the process, the discovery process contains two parts: the collection and then the interpretation. Collection is the information and tasks and data collection through elicitation and observation, and then we will use certain filters, and then the next stage is the interpretation, where we interpret what we have collected. We create a mission statement for what we need to do. We create a requirements documentation, and we also create the project management documents. The first thing that we need to do is to discover or explore the work domain. We need to know what is our work domain. Is it, for example, tracking inventory? Is it customer orders? Is it billing? Is it websites? Is it a hospital? We need to concentrate on what our work domain is. We need to identify the stakeholders of the work domain, the people who are involved, people who do the work, the people who manage, the people who are affected by the output of the work, the people who benefit from this work. We have four types of stakeholders. We have primary, secondary, facilitator, and indirect. Primary is the person who uses the design or the project directly. Secondary person who either supplies input or receives output. Facilitator is a person who maintains and develops and manages the design, and indirect person who is affected by the use of the design but has no contact with the design. Primary stakeholders should have the most impact. We should get the most information from the primary stakeholders. We also need to understand the competition. We need to know what's on the market. We need to assess the positive and the negative aspects of what is on the market, and we need to respect copyrights and copyrighted materials. How do we organize the discovery process? Data collection and data interpretation must be viewed as an integrated whole. So the collection and the interpretation is part of one process, and both of them complement each other. We use the 5W plus H heuristic to provide focus on data collection activities. Of course, 5W, where, when, why, who, and how. The what and how, what activities are involved, the where and when. We need to understand the impact of the physical location on the workflow. Where do things take place? The who and why, who is involved, why they are involved, the roles of the people, etc. We need to pass all the data that is collected through filters. Filters can be physical. Where is this done? What objects are involved, the physical aspects. We also need to pass it through a cultural filter. Cultural in terms of, we need to look at it in terms of the relationship between people. We also need to concentrate on functional, or put it through functional filters. What can we also look, how can we also look at these activities in terms of what actually happens? What needs or what functionalities need to be performed? And also we need to put it through an informational filter. We can look at these activities in terms of the information that is involved. What information do we need to perform a task? How does the information flow in and out? How is the information generated and how is it consumed? Is it reports? Is it outputted? Is it provided to some machine that creates something? So in the discovery process, we need, first of all, we need to know what and how. And we need to pass it through functional, physical, and informational filter. We need to know the where and when in terms of physical and functional, and we need to know who and why in terms of cultural, functional, and informational. Data collected must be organized, of course. The tools that we use, we have several tools. We have task analysis. We analyze each and every task and subtask. We can do storyboarding. Storyboarding, use stories and scenarios. We can use use cases. Use cases are a way to describe using actors and functionalities or tasks to describe a certain functionality. And we need information about the primary stakeholder profiles. What are the methods of collection? We need to collect this information, so we need methods. We have two main methods. We have the observation and elicitation. Observation is we observe and get information about the activities and the context of the work environment. Elicitation involves direct or indirect investigation through interviews, focus groups, and questionnaires. If we look at the data collection, as we said, we have observation and we have direct and indirect. We either observe them directly, directly by being in the workspace, or indirectly by using recording media, etc. Elicitation, we do direct or indirect. Direct, like in interviews and focus groups. Indirect, like questionnaires, and our questions can be structured or unstructured, or can be open-ended or constrained. Direct observation, we use, like we said, we use ethnographic methods, like going into the work site and observing the people. Indirect, we can use, like we said, recording devices, for example. Concerns about the direct observations. Our presence might affect the people positively or negatively, or they will act in a way that is not in line with what they do naturally, or our presence might become annoying. We also need to pay attention to distributed cognition, which is the tendency to offload cognitive tasks to objects in the environment or to distribute them among team members or co-workers. How is it done? How is it distributed? How the tasks are distributed? How they work together cognitively. Second is elicitation. Elicitation, we said that it's direct or indirect. Direct through interviews, focus groups. Indirect through looking at documentation, logs and notes, and using questionnaires. Let's start with the direct. Direct methods involve face-to-face communication. We need to pay attention to physical aspects, where and what objects, cultural aspects, what is the culture and the environment. We need to have a neutral linguistic approach, an approach that is understood by everybody. We need to pay attention to individual communication styles, different individual communication styles. Direct can be interviews, on-site interviews, or away from the job. And interviews we can use open-ended questions to let people express themselves about complex topics, or closed-ended questions that can be answered with yes or no or simple responses. Interviews can be unstructured, just, for example, you go into the interview and say, tell me about what you do, how do you work, what you perform. Or can be structured. We can start with, what is your daily routine? How do you perform this process? What processes do you perform? And so on. Interviews, we can have predefined scenarios. The interviewer can use predefined scenarios to stimulate conversation, to start with the conversation and get people warmed up. We can focus on a purpose of the interview and define and explain the focus of the interview to the interviewed person, so that they understand what the object or the goal of the interview is. We need to perform a wrap-up to share our thoughts and the results of the interview with the stakeholders. And we need to, for example, we can use advanced organizers to help us with the design process. Direct, we also use focus groups. Focus groups, we have a moderator or facilitator to discuss, and we put the stakeholders and we start talking about the subject, but we need to maintain spontaneity and have clearly defined outcomes, what we need to discuss and what outcomes do we expect, and provide the participants with the context for the project. Advantages of focus groups: relatively inexpensive. They can be used early in the design process to help identify and prioritize features and help people to gain insight into people's attitudes and motivations. Disadvantages: it only represents the views of one particular group or one way of doing things. Maybe they are not statistically significant. Some research shows that they might be not statistically significant, and they do not provide information about usability. They will talk about their experience, but with no usability feedback. Indirect, we can look at corporate documentation, information about the corporate policies, procedures, processes, etc. We can also look at logs and notes. For example, we can ask people to keep logs of specific activities. We can collect notes people make to remind them of procedures and policies if they have these notes, and so on. Some people keep notes, personal notes on how to do things, so we might take a look at these. We can also use questionnaires for indirect. Questionnaires are familiar, can be open or closed-ended questions. They can include mutually exclusive choices, non-mutually exclusive choices. Mutually exclusive, only one choice. Non-mutually, we might have more than one choice. We might have range, from two. We might have scales. We might have short answers or comments. When using scales, we identify the significant units. For example, like we see here, 1 is not helpful, 5 is very helpful, and in between. Okay, we can use positive and negative. If we want neutral, they have to be odd numbers. If we want to either positive or negative, we have to have an even number of choices and so on. Advantages of questionnaires, they do not involve face-to-face contact and can be administered remotely. They can supply information for primary stakeholder profiles. We will get information about primary stakeholders from the questionnaires. They can be used to ascertain whether proposed solutions will meet acceptance or not. They can be used to double check the feedback obtained from one-to-one interviews if we have already performed interviews, and they can reach a large audience with little expense and in parallel. Disadvantages of questionnaires: if the questions are vague, they might not be useful to the purpose of our design. Sometimes people do not like to fill out long questionnaires, so they end up just filling the questionnaires without paying real attention to the questions. Closed-ended questions can restrict responses. The open-ended questions can be hard to quantify or to assess. Guidelines for questionnaires: we have to be consistent, we have to phrase instructions, we have to speak the user's language, avoid technical jargon, order the question beginning with easy and less controversial, use logical grouping of questions. Questions about process can be grouped together, question about the experience can be grouped together, and so on. Use appropriate elements, radio buttons, checkboxes, and so on. Use appropriate scales, avoid overlapping ranges, include none of the above where appropriate, and so on. Now, after the data collection comes the interpretation. The interpretation, we use task analysis, storyboarding, use cases, and primary stakeholder profiles. Task analysis. Task analysis is a way of documenting how people perform tasks. Task analysis includes all the aspects of the work, from the start of the task till the end of the task. What is done and what steps are involved in doing the task. We decompose the task, linear description of the process from A to Z. Okay, we can also perform a hierarchical task analysis, what we call an HTA, that provides a top-down structure. We can divide it into a hierarchy. When we decompose the task, we identify the process, we describe the steps, include the following: the reasons for actions, who perform, and the objects that are required to complete the actions. Task decomposition also tries to, or should try to, capture flow of information, objects and artifacts that we use, what sequence of actions and what are the dependencies between different actions, what are the required environmental conditions, and the cultural or the work environment constraints. The task decomposition includes defining what the goal is, what information is needed, what physical objects we need to find this information, what methods we use to, or various ways to proceed, what are the objectives, goals, and sub-goals, what are the triggers and the procedures, and what are the contingency plans. In case we did something wrong, we have to retract and so on. Hierarchical task analysis, we start with a specific goal and then we add tasks or sub-goals. And if we want to show it in a graphical manner, we have a box on top of the other boxes that describes what we want to do, and then the boxes under the box describe how it is done. For example, if we want to schedule a meeting, this is the task. We have to perform contact and then send group emails about the meeting and then consult team members. And then afterwards, we confirm responses. So it's a hierarchy. And we might in one of the hierarchies, we can have more than one path. For example, we can coordinate for the coordinate schedule. We can schedule AV. We can do more than one thing. We can in parallel. We can schedule AV equipment and we can schedule a conference room and check if the AV has been assigned to us and the room has been assigned to us. So we can do more than one thing in parallel and then confirm the meeting. The second interpretation method is storyboarding. Storyboarding involves using a series of pictures that describe a particular process or workflow. We can brainstorm or we can use certain softwares that will provide pictures to describe the process from the beginning till the end. Use cases is another form. Use cases usually use graphical presentation. They might use something that we call unified modeling language standard to show it's a unified model. The actors are shown in a certain way, the tasks are shown in a certain way, and we built a use case from these parts or presentations. Of course, in the use cases, two main components are the actor and the use cases to represent the goals and the tasks. Let's look at an example. For example, to schedule a meeting, we have the coordinator as an actor, we have the team member as an actor, we have the conference room as an actor, and we have the AV equipment as an actor. And the use case is the coordinator requests the room, the conference room, and the coordinator requests the equipment, the coordinator contact the team members, and so on and so on, so forth. Use cases might have a primary path and alternative paths. Primary path is the path that is usually taken to do or perform a task. Alternate paths test if exceptions happen, what exception handling capabilities the system has. For example, if the premature termination of the process, what do we do? If we need to choose a different method, what we do? If we have error conditions, what we do, and so on. Use cases, we come up with scenarios. Each unique path, each unique use case or use case path creates a scenario. Scenarios represent discrete instances that combine to create the complete use case, that are combined to create a use case. So we have one scenario of doing it or another scenario of doing it in case errors happen and so on. And they are the lowest level of the use case and should cover all conceivable paths and alternative paths. Now in the interpretation, we need to also get primary stakeholders profiles. We need to define our target users. So we need to know what is the context of use, what cognitive abilities are needed, what physical abilities are needed, and what individual profile for the users is needed. We can get those profiles in terms of the context of use. For example, we can ask about motivation, frequency, user categories, task nature, interaction mode, social environment, technical environment, and so on. We can fill them up and deduct information from them. Cognitive abilities, the way the users interact with each other to perform the task. For example, what educational level must they have? What typing skills? What domain knowledge? Cognitive styles? Is it visual, auditory, graphical, linguistics, etc. Also, we need to get information about physical abilities, what the visual abilities should be, auditory abilities, and haptic abilities. We also need, for the individual profiles, we need to know the ages, the occupations, genders. This might help in performing a primary stakeholder profile. All what was discussed and done before should be documented. We should have a mission statement that contains the project goals, what is the value proposition, what needs will the new system address, how will it address these needs, what is the project scope, what will the design include or exclude, what are the external constraints in terms of time, finance, compliance, etc. How will you decide when it satisfies the design proposal? We need a requirements document. We need functional requirements, informational requirements, physical requirements, what are the inputs and the outputs, and also the constraints. We need project management requirements. We need to define the tasks involved in the project. We need to have risk document. We need to have evaluation criteria. How do we evaluate? We need to the implementation, project implementation documents, training documents, maintenance documents, and future needs documents if the project is ongoing. Thank you very much for listening.